So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I will give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in this palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, "Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination." "Then impale Haman on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided.
Good morning. It's really a joy and a privilege to be here with you today. I feel so privileged to share from what the Spirit has given to me over the years, many, many years. I want to thank Bart and the board and for all those texts and everybody who's read scriptures and so forth. For your role. I know I ask a lot of you. And if you noticed on the painting over here that hangs in Barton's office, you notice that they were all sitting in a circle. We didn't try and change the chairs around, but there was no platform, there was no lectern when Native people gathered. They just sat in a circle and said what the Spirit led them. So hopefully this morning, these words will resonate with you. The scripture that Katie read was very fitting. In fact, I wondered when I first started to look at the uniqueness of today being Native American Sunday, the scriptures, what they might be. And I was struck with this one, that was an electionary. And this story of Esther, the book of Esther is this interesting book. There's no mention of Jerusalem. There's no mention of the Promised Land. There's no mention of miracles or prayers, prophets or laws. All those things are not there. God isn't even named in the book. One would wonder why this book ever made it into the Hebrew Scripture. It's because it's about the salvation of the Jewish people from extinction. And I thought, as I looked at that, I thought, wow, that really fits with Native American reality. Almost extinct. If some had wished it was a native problem, it was referred to, the native problem was the phrase that was used around the country. But the thing was that Esther understood her role. She had to conceal. She was adopted. She was an orphan, and she was adopted by her uncle Mordecai. And Mordecai had been successful in preventing an assassination of the king. So when she ended up in a harem, she had to hide her identity as a Jewish person. This person, Haman, was determined to liquidate the Jewish people there in Persia. And so it was very interesting how she used her closeness to the king to save her people. She understood her identity. And like each one of us, when we get it, when we understand who we are and what we're about, then our sense of purpose, our sense of vision becomes more evident to us. The Native people had this struggle of survival. When the Europeans came here, there was estimates from anywhere from, in the Americas, from 60 to 100 million indigenous people here in this area we call the Americas. 60 being the minimum, 60 million. And within 100 years, it was down to 6 million. Not just by killing them off, but by the diseases that the Europeans brought for which the native people had no protection. Today, there's about 5 million in the United States, 75% of which live not on reservations, but live out in the rest of the country. The thing that struck me is when I look at Native history, you know, when the Spanish were here in Florida conquering this area, and the indigenous tribes that were here, there were like 17 primary ones and another 20-some small bands. Among these, the Spanish had to figure out what to do with them. They weren't all hostile. In fact, most of them were very friendly. But even with that, in 1770, the Spanish invaders had to figure out what to do with them, these native people. So most of them were Catholic, not the Indians, but the native people, but the soldiers. So they wrote a letter to the Pope asking if it was okay, if it was a sin to kill the native people, the indigenous people. Even if they were friendly, it was still okay to kill them. That was their thinking. When the U.S. government became a reality here in this country, Florida became a problem for native people here. And the U.S. government decided to solve the problem by carving out certain areas that native people could occupy. So from St. Petersburg, basically down to Tampa, 15 miles or 20 miles in from the border, from the ocean or from the Gulf of Mexico, this whole territory in which we are situated, by the Treaty of Moultrie Treaty in 1823, was given to the native people. It's yours to have. We're not going to invade this area. That was really a wonderful gift. It lasted 9 years. Just recently, some of us have been struck by the reality with the Gabby Petito killing. You know, that here is a white woman who gets, and I have no problem with the fact that her death has caused many of us to look at the tragedy that happened to her, which is still unfolding as days go on. But in the last 10 years, there's been over 710 Native people in the state of Wyoming who have been either killed or disappeared. And they got no news coverage. Why? Are we blind to these people? Have we deafened ourselves to their voices? You know, I listen to this wonderful story of Esther and what she did to rescue her people, and think of how Native people have struggled over this centuries with the invasion of the Europeans, how they have survived, and what they have to offer us. Since I've been 13, 14, 15 years of age, I've studied them, and I've worked when I could with them, and visited their reservations, and gone to their powwows, and constructed artifacts and headdresses. And these two here are just some of the ones. I've given most of them away. But, you know, we have these tragedies. And we look at this story of Esther, we still end up with a story where the solution is violence. Kill Haman. He was going to kill the Jewish people, so let's kill him. Is there another story? Is there another scripture? Can we find something in the New Testament that gives us hope? Colin, can you share with us that scripture?
Hello. So in Mark 11, verses 15 through 18, it says, "On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, 'It is not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers.' The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching."
Thank you, Colin. It's often called cleansing the temple story. Let me give you two backdrop things first before we delve into the meaning of this story that Colin read. First of all, I want to talk to you a little about biblical texts. And I'm not going to try and drag this out. Those of you who did the study on the Bible probably heard some of this, but just very quickly, we have no original text. The oldest New Testament we have is from the 4th century. We have pieces, fragments earlier than that, but they still don't go back to the time of the original writings. They're all transcripts of transcripts. The oldest one we have is late, about 175 of the Common Era, and it's only the size of a credit card. It's a couple verses out of John. So we don't really have the original text, but what we do have are pieces, and we have based our understanding of Scripture from study. And when I've listened to scholars, and particularly people, my favorite being John Dominic Crossan, others who've been helped me to understand Scripture, I've really come to believe that our Scriptures, as we know it, particularly these 4 Gospels, are really late. The early Christians, the followers of Jesus, disciples as we call them, really expected Jesus to come back any day now. But he didn't. And things happened. And as it got later and later into that 1st century, there may have been collections. Some people talk about the Q Gospel. If that exists, we never found it. But sometime around 70 and thereafter, people started to write the stories that we call the Gospels, Mark being the oldest one. So what propelled them to write that was the fact that the temple was destroyed. This sacred place. And most of us as Christians never grew up to understand what the temple was. We know that Solomon started the whole process almost 1,000 years before Christ, built the first temple, And it was a huge thing, beautiful thing, but it didn't last. It got destroyed by the Babylonians. About 500 years before the time of Christ, another temple, what's called the Second Temple, was built after they came back by the Medo-Persians. And it was built, and it became desecrated repeatedly until about 150 or 175 before the Common Era. Then finally they liquidated, cleansed that temple, but what they had was an edifice that way is bigger than most of us understand. It actually covered the size of about 30 football fields. Now think of a mega church, 30 football fields in size. Took 10,000 builders to build it, had a staff of 18,000 priests and Levites. Huge place. All these areas that are relegated to common people, to Jewish people, to male Jewish people, to priests, etc. So it's a big place, and it gets destroyed in 70 Common Era. The thing about that temple area is right on the northwest corner of it sits the Tower of Antonio, which was built by the Romans so they could look down into the temple and watch what was going on. And what was going on down there was constantly a lot of activity, thousands of people coming and going. So now, having covered a little bit about text, a little bit about the temple, let me talk about this text that Colin read. It comes across like another illustration of violence. You know, in Mark's story, there's no whipping of anybody. You know, scholars question whether those were things which were added or the original, whatever, but I'm not going to get into all of that technical stuff. But I do want you to ask yourself a question. What visions can we derive from this story? If Esther had a vision for her path, what did the people and what can we derive from this story in Mark's gospel? First of all, I want to say I think the first vision I have is a vision of resistance. Now, Jesus obviously was resisting something. But resistance wasn't something that Jesus invented in the temple area and in Jerusalem. The occupation by the Romans was a problem for the Jewish people. Actually, before the time of Christ, or right around the birth of Christ, before what we call BC, or before the Common Era, there was quite a substantial resistance demonstration. About 3,000 Jews were killed by the Romans. And around 23 in the Common Era, while Jesus was here in Israel, there was another big resistance. This time it took place right along the Mediterranean Sea at Caesarea. It's interesting, this Pilate had just become the head for the Roman people there in Israel, and that's where his headquarters were, over in Caesarea. So the Jewish people went over there to protest some of his plans, and for 5 days they stayed outside of his headquarters pleading to stop, get out, leave us alone, let us worship. Pilate threatened them, told them he would liquidate them. He sent his soldiers out. They drew their swords. And what did the Jewish people do? They stuck their necks out, said, go ahead, cut our throats. Such a resistance. 40 AD, or 40 Common Era, same kind of thing happens up in Petonius, up at Phoenicia. This time, they say there was over 10,000 Jewish people who gathered up there for days to resist the Roman Empire. And again, they were willing to be killed, have their children killed, have their grandmothers killed. We learn these things not from the Bible. We learn these things from people like Josephus and Philo, who were historians at the time, who wrote about these things. But here you have in this story a single individual who comes into the temple and does this to demonstrate resistance. He's there not to just clean up the temple. He's there to resist what the temple has become. And I ask us today, what is equivalent for us in this day and age of resisting what the church and what our faith has become? Each of you has to figure that out for yourself. I know what I felt I've been called to, what is clear as far as my sense of resistance. I ask you, I plead with you, to find the Spirit to lead you as to what resistance you need to show and manifest. Dominic Crossan, one of my favorite phrases of his is that you show your love for your enemies by resisting them, by resisting the evil that they show. We love our enemies by resisting them nonviolently, maybe turning over their tables, maybe doing some other things. Linda and I give some support to the Lakota Law Project, who are the water protectors, and others up in the Dakotas and Minnesota and so forth. And they're resisting the pipelines. That's one form. You find your way. Ask your spirit. Follow whatever the vision tells you, and become a force that must be reckoned with. Jesus was that, and the Romans were watching that, and the temple personnel were watching it. That's why he was such a threat, because there was a collusion going on between the Romans and those who were in charge of the temple. In Matthew's account of this story, a little later, there's a whole bunch of what are called the woes, the 7 woes, where Jesus says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees! Woe unto you, you hypocrites!" There are 7 of them. Go read them, the 25th chapter, I think, or 23rd chapter of Matthew. And that's where he calls them blind guides, and he calls them hypocrites and white sepulchres, and he tells them, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, unto God the things that are God's. How did the native people do it? Well, Troy talked about that time when the Dakotas sang a hymn while they're being executed by our U.S. government. You know, we have to figure out how to do this, how to resist, how to be a force that must be taken seriously. And I'm not here to tell you how you need to do it. But I must close with the other vision that I think is even more difficult than the vision I just mentioned about resisting. And that's a vision that is called kenosis in Greek, self-emptying. When Paul was talking about Jesus, he said that he emptied himself, in the King James Version. He emptied himself and became obedient unto death. He took the form of a servant. Now, that kenosis, to me, is an important concept. How do we empty ourselves? Well, let me just tell you how I think Jesus did it that day. Jesus walked into the temple. I mean, he went there more than just once. He walked in that day, and he had a really sharp memory. He walked in, he remembered what it was like when he was 12 years of age. And Luke 2 tells us this wonderful story about how his parents took him to the temple and how they'd left him behind, and they came back and found him there in the temple, and all the teachers of the law and doctors and so forth are gathered around him in conversation. They were amazed at him. And this is a memory he has of what it was like to be the center and have that kind of command, that kind of importance, that those who were teachers of the law would sit with you and listen to you and talk with you and explain to you. And what did he see? He didn't see any of that. He didn't see any children being huddled around and being listened to. He didn't see teachers of the law listening to common people. What did he see? He saw a system that was exploiting people. Children who were coming with their offerings, as insignificant as others might think it was, a pigeon or a turtle dove or whatever it was. And why wasn't this good enough, what they brought? What that says to me is Jesus understood the importance of emptying himself in that moment. And how do you do that? You look at the privileges you've had and say, I can live without some of these privileges. How many times do you get up, take a shower, and let the water run? The cold water run until it gets warm. When they have a shortage of water to fight fires, or countries throughout this world who have no pure water to drink. All the privileges we have, how do we live without them? How do we, maybe can't strip ourselves of them, but basically we have to understand that Jesus at that moment said, that what happened to me at 12, I don't want any part of that kind of privilege. I think there are times in each of our lives where we have to say no. I can't do this anymore. I don't need this privilege. Sometimes it happens when you are standing face to face with your child or your boss, or sometimes husbands when you're standing confronting your wife, your partner, and you're saying, I need to listen rather than teach or guide or argue. I hope some of this makes sense to you. One of the things that I cherished about Jesus was that he understood that everything matters and all of the universe is spirit connected. I'm going to ask Melinda Joy Miller to come up and join me. We're going to visit the stones and I'm going to let her explain what happened here 2 years ago. Jesus one time was told by the crowd to tell his disciples to shut up. And he said, if I were to do that, these very stones would cry out. He understood that the very stones of earth are not just God's creation, but they also have a spirit that we need to pay attention to. And hopefully, as we visit this morning and you think about what Joy is going to share with you, you will learn to understand why these bags are hanging here. Tell us. Do you have a phone, Mike?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here and to share with you. This is from the Seneca Nation, which is in the